Domestic strife and party rage forego. Collect your strength and urge it on the foe. See, Pennsylvania bleeds in every vein. Her house is ravaged and her children slain. Hear her to arms, her parent country call, lest both should perish in one common fall. Rouse, Britons, roused from sloth and dull delays. Be what you were in Anne's and Edward's days. A bit of a disclaimer before I dive into this. The main source of information I used was a primary source document written by Williamson himself describing his life up to the point of writing, and paying special attention to violent and barbaric acts committed by Native Americans, especially in cases when British subjects were victimized by it. Now, the question we should ask ourselves when looking at any historical document is, why did the author write this? In this case, the clear purpose for writing is to depict the native tribes of the New World as savages and to motivate British people from all British-controlled land to do something about the lawless violence that these people live by. Now, I don't necessarily blame him for writing this piece of propaganda. If a group of people burned down my home, kept me as a slave for 2 months, and made me live outside during the winter with not much clothing for myself, I would also write an entire book about the needless acts of violence they commit, no matter what culture they come from. But all the same, with that in mind, as we're reading, we should be looking out for places where the author might have exaggerated or skewed the truth to strengthen his point. Oh, and if you're squeamish about descriptions of extreme violence, this might not be the video for you. Let's get started. The year is 1738. The place is Aberdeen, Scotland. An 8-year-old boy named Peter Williamson, son of William Williamson, who had previously been living with his parents in the countryside, goes to live with his aunt in the city. Unfortunately, this arrangement didn't last for long. One day, he was down at the docks, and some men lured him into the below decks of their ship where they kept him, along with several other kidnapped children, to be sold in the New World. And just like that, any hope he had of a normal life free from danger and adventure sailed away over the horizon. Well, adventure certainly found them when, instead of landing as they planned to after an 11-week journey, their ship was beached on an island off the coast of Cape May. The kidnappers, realizing they could escape to civilization in a small rowboat but would have to cut their losses and leave their human cargo behind to die in the wilderness, did just that. First impressions of America? Wild. Thankfully to many of us, and to all of them, a ship happened to come along and noticed them. This ship was on its way from Boston and traveling to none other than the city of Philadelphia. In this city, he was sold into indentured servitude for a contract of 7 years. Young Peter's contract was bought, by coincidence, by another Brit named Hugh Wilson. This guy, also by coincidence, was likewise taken while young to the New World, where he built up his life from nothing. Despite being wealthy enough to own indentured servants, Hugh had no children of his own. It was basically the best situation Peter could have hoped to find himself in, given the circumstances. He became like sort of an adopted child to Mr. Wilson. He got easy tasks until he was old enough to handle harder labor, and he even agreed to stay on 1 extra year in exchange for some schooling. He ended up going to school for 5 years. Nice. Hugh Wilson would die in 1747 when Peter was 17 years old. He would leave behind a modest savings of 120 sterling that Peter would inherit. From there, Peter would spend his time traveling around and doing odd jobs for whoever would hire him, until at the age of 24, he married the daughter of a farmer and received a 200-acre farm in Berks County as a dowry. In 1754. Anyone familiar with some of the things going on in Berks County in 1754? It was an October night. Peter's wife was away visiting family. He was sitting alone at home. He hears a knock on his door, and a voice in broken English yells at him to come out of the house. A glance out the window reveals about a dozen Native Americans. Not knowing what to do, Peter grabs a gun and sheepishly opens the door. They instantly grab him and steal the gun. He doesn't resist. He stands helpless and watches as the Indians take what they want from his house and then burn it when they're done. They then give him a heavy load of loot to carry and set off. And so, for the second time in his life, Peter was abducted and taken away from everything he knew. They marched all night. When they stopped, they tied Peter to a tree. They then lit a fire and started to play with burning him. They burned his hands and his feet, and told him to stay quiet and not scream through the whole thing. When he started crying quietly, they told him, "Your face is wet, let me dry it for you," and held the fire close to his face. He writes, "Terrible and shocking to the human nature were the barbarities daily committed by the savages, and not to be paralleled in all the volumes of history." The next night, after some more marching, the group of Indians come to another house. This one had more than one inhabitant. Peter watched as they scalped the 2 parents and 5 of their children. They kept one of the boys alive and made him carry more things, the same job they gave to Peter. The boy, however, was not as brave or as quiet as Peter. He complained a lot, so they scalped him less than 24 hours after they captured him. Peter later finds out that the Indians were selling all these scalps to French soldiers for 15 sterling apiece. Williamson goes on to talk about more houses raided by his captors, particularly notable of which is a house where, he implies this using vague and polite terms, they did things to the body of a dead woman and made her husband watch. They then captured the husband and tortured him for several days while he prayed, before killing him. Also mentioned is a night where his group of Indians met with another group of Indians from the same tribe. While they were together, the prisoners got a chance to exchange stories of the horrors their captors committed. Peter writes that he often wished he had never left the custody of the kidnappers who took him to America. But God enabled me to wait with more than common patience for a deliverance I daily prayed for. Wow, I usually make these videos longer, but we covered a whole lot that episode, so I'm gonna leave it off there. Till next time. Hey everybody, so if you didn't get the disclaimer at the beginning of the part 1 video, here's another one. This video contains descriptions of very brutal, very violent, very bloody murders that most likely did actually happen. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, here we go. At the end of the pillaging season, all the raiding parties of Native Americans assembled. Besides Peter, they had 3 prisoners with them. The first 2 they tied to a tree and burned alive. The third they buried in the ground up to his neck. They then ripped the scalp off his head. After a few hours of suffering, the Indians lit a fire next to his head. The man screamed for a mercy killing as his eyes melted out of the sockets and his brains boiled. This is real life. Peter was made to dig graves for them. Williamson, for whatever reason, was kept alive. The Indians took him back to their more permanent settlement, where their women and children were, to be kept as a slave during the winter. Peter describes it as being 200 miles from any civilization. While there, he describes at length a cultural custom in which those of the community who are too old to hunt for food are forcibly killed by the young of the tribe. This is done by swinging tomahawks at their heads, sometimes taking up to an hour for the skull to crack open. While at the settlement, he calls the name Alamingo, he was left outside the whole time with few clothes except for some scraps of material that the natives used to clothe themselves. He built a small structure for himself, resembling one of the Indian wigwams that he saw, and he had to keep a fire burning in it almost constantly for fear of freezing to death. This went on for months until very early spring, 1755, a war party of 150 Indians was gathered to once again raid in rural Pennsylvania, and they took Peter with them. Well, after starting up travel again, of course one of Peter's main thoughts is escape. He waits for a good moment, because he knows if he gets captured after trying to escape, he'll be killed in the most brutal way imaginable. Finally, there's a time during the night when all of the captors are fast asleep. Peter notices this and just sort of walks off. A little distance away, he can hear one of them yelling. They woke up. They know he's gone. He has to run. He runs a long distance until he finds a hollow tree that he can hide in. He's tired. He climbs inside. Moments later, he hears footsteps and voices. The Indians are outside looking for him. Eventually, it gets quiet. Peter stays in there. He stays in there all day before coming out, because he wants to make sure the Indians are far away. This was one of the riskiest moments of his life. When he comes out, his next goal is to find a road, or any kind of civilization again. He's alone in the woods. He wanders. He's lost for days. Eventually, he climbs a tall hill, and from the top, he can see a house. He knows that house. He knows where he is. Overjoyed, he rushes towards it and knocks on the door. He hears screaming inside. A moment later, the door opens, and his old friend, John Bell, is pointing a gun at him. It was then that he realized he looked very much like a Native American. He then did his best to explain very quickly that, no, he was not an Indian, yes, he was Peter, and no, he did not die months ago when his house was attacked. With that confusing and potentially dangerous situation cleared up, they invite Peter inside. He stays for a few days, gets a good night's sleep, gets cleaned up, starts eating full meals, and is gifted with sufficient clothing for the first time in a very long while. Being fully recovered, and now knowing where he is and what day it is, he sets out to travel east. On January 4th, he will arrive at his father-in-law's house and found out that his wife is dead, not from Indians, but from illness. With no family, no home, and no money, he is now little better than he was when he left Hugh Wilson's service. What he did have now, though, was quite a story to tell. Everybody, wherever he went, after they heard that Peter Williamson was back from the dead, they wanted him to tell him all about it. Even the government of Pennsylvania, the Assembly and the governor, summoned Peter to tell them what he knew about the military situation of any French or French-aligned Indians that he saw. After being back for some time, he now faced the decision of what to do next. Well, he still technically owned the land that him and his wife were living on before, but all the buildings were burned down, and if he went back to rebuild, what's stopping the same group of Indians from coming to find him again? No, he didn't want that to happen. He couldn't just live off the hospitality of his father-in-law either. He needed to go get a job somewhere. Where he would go to look for one is the city of Philadelphia, and where he would find one was the Royal Army. Peter Williamson would join the army and fight in the French and Indian War. In March, he arrived in Boston, where his regiment under command of General Shirley was training. Peter makes a habit of writing his impressions of every large city he visits. He says of this one, a gentleman of London would fancy himself at home in Boston. During his time in training, there was an incident where the house of a prominent citizen was attacked by Indians. The man, his wife, and 9 of their servants were scalped and killed, and the children were not found, assumed to be taken prisoner. Now, if there's one thing Americans have always done well, it's vigilante posses. In response to public outcry, a group of 100 volunteers, including Peter and some of the soldiers he was training with, set out to hunt down the Indians that did this. It took them a few days of tracking the party through the woods, but they eventually found the party of 50 Native Americans responsible for the crime. There was a fight, and the 100-man mob won. After the fight, they found the dead man's daughter, starved half to death, clothes ripped to shreds, and tied to a tree. The men untied her and carried her on a stretcher and helped her recover. When she could talk, she told them how the Indians scalped her brother and made fun of him while he was suffering. They then cut his stomach open and removed some of his guts. But he was still alive. They put pine wood in it and lit it on fire and kept making fun of him. Finally, they burned him alive while she watched. After rescuing the girl, the men in the lynch mob argued over who gets to cut the scalps off the dead Indian bodies. On July 1st, 1755, the regiment, fully trained, started marching. The plan was to stop at Albany and then keep going to Oswego, which at the time was an English fort on the southern coast of Lake Ontario. Peter mentions that there's also an Indian trading post at the fort and takes the opportunity to write a little more about Indian culture. He writes that Native American babies, when they're born, look a lot like white babies. Most natives put effort into tanning and rubbing grease on their skin in order to darken their skin tone. He also writes that French religious missionaries spread lies among the Indian community saying that the English killed Jesus Christ and that the second coming of Jesus would happen after all English people were killed. Go figure. The people defending Oswego Fort, well, they had a bit of a tough time. Constant paranoia, worrying that the French could attack at any time and knowing that if they did, they could probably take the fort easily because they had more troops and better boats on the lake. The pay was bad, the food was bad, and sometimes not enough. Disease was going around. Many of the soldiers just deserted and ran away. In the cold fall months of 1755, Peter managed to fall into a river. His friends helped him out and dried him off, and soon after had him sitting with them around a fire, when suddenly he just went pale and fainted. They marked him as injured and sent him to a hospital in New York. There he made a full recovery. He writes that New York is ritzy, aristocratic, and that the people there are good at drinking. After his recovery, Peter asks his general for time off to visit Pennsylvania. He was granted 3 months. Williamson visits Philadelphia again. During the better part of a year while he was away, people seem to have gotten a lot more on edge. The Indian attacks hadn't stopped. In fact, they had been getting more frequent and coming further east, even striking some places that people might refer to as West Philly. It seemed like everyone had a sort of anger and fear to match the ferocity of the attacks. He reports that Berks County was now more or less a wasteland of burned or abandoned houses, and that hundreds, if not thousands of people now found themselves on the streets of Philly without a place to stay. He tells more stories of Indian attacks. He talks about homes with newborn babies who were scalped along with their parents, one in particular where the mother's dead body was found with the dead baby being used as a pillow, and even tells one story about a woman who intentionally fell down on top of her baby so that when the Indians scalped her they didn't notice the baby underneath and left it to grow up as an orphan. Williamson observes that Pennsylvania probably could have defeated their Native American enemies if it weren't for the pacifist nature of the large Quaker population influencing the local government, making them averse to the idea of any armed militia. The thing that changed their minds, he records, was a visit. Messengers from a friendly Indian tribe to the city of Philadelphia. The messengers announced that without the help of the English or some other ally, they would lose the war. The French-aligned tribes recently sent a message saying that if they did not betray the English, they would come and burn the village and destroy their tribe's language and culture. If they tried, the friendly tribe did not have enough warriors to stop it. Because of the urgent nature of this request, this would be the last plea from the friendly Indians for a friendly militia from Philadelphia. The letter was read aloud in the public square. Peter witnessed the authorities in Philadelphia have a heated discussion, resulting in the allowance of a civilian-run militia with officers elected by the soldiers who would communicate with the Pennsylvania government. Having nothing better to do with the rest of his 3 months, Peter joined, and since he had experience fighting as a trained regular in the British Army, he was assigned a position training 100 new recruits and given the rank of acting lieutenant. In December 1755, they would march west to reclaim Pennsylvania's frontier from the Indians.
Hark now the drums beat up again, for old true soldier gentlemen, then let us list and march, I say, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders.
In December of 1755, Williamson and his 100 trainees marched west to one of several places in the Pennsylvania frontier that badly needed defense. On the 26th of December, they arrived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the locals of which asked them if they could scout and investigate an abandoned town just to the west, which had been deserted due to Indian attacks. After dark, Peter took 50 troops to go and look at things. They were almost there. The town was in sight, just across the river, when, like ghosts, a group of Indians started shooting at them from behind. A couple people fell. Peter made the split-second decision to order a running fire across the river towards the church building in the town. They would run and shoot at the same time. It worked well until they hit the water. It was cold. Freezing cold. Finally, they got across and got inside. More than 30 people made it to the church. They started shooting from the windows, keeping the Indians from getting close enough to light the building on fire and burn them all. Some people started lighting the pews on fire for warmth. They really needed it because they were still wet from the river, and the December weather was not generous. For an impressive 6 hours, they were able to hold like that. But when they started to get low on ammo and powder, they knew they had to do something. Peter, being the commanding officer, it was his job to make a decision. He thought about it and saw that there was only one way out of this. They would have to run for it, all at once. A lot of them would die, but if they made it to the wood line, they might be able to make it back to Bethlehem. They started preparing, and they went for it. Out of over 30 people, 5 of them made it out of the town. 2 of them froze to death before dawn. Peter and 2 others were lucky enough to make it back to Bethlehem and tell everyone what happened. Peter's commanding officer, when he heard about the situation, decided to send 1,600 troops to help them out. In the meantime, Peter and his remaining men were to start building defenses. On January 6th, the 1,600 arrived. They moved into the abandoned town, ready to bury the dead men that went with Peter the previous week. And they found bones. No meat, just bones. And the church where they made their stand was burned to the ground. The dead men appeared to have been cannibalized. They buried what they could and started building a fort on the site where the church once stood. They called it Fort Allen. I wonder what happened to this place called Fort Allen, just to the west of Bethlehem. Probably nothing important. After the fort was complete, 1,400 troops, including Peter, went even further west. What they saw gave them an eerie feeling. Places that had been occupied 2 years ago were now in the early stages of being reclaimed by nature. The past century of building had been undone just that fast. This would be the closest that Native Americans would ever come to being really free of European colonization. The troops began making contact with the places and people who managed to keep their land safe. Then they started setting up defenses. They set up a whole network in the local area where they would regularly patrol, and they would skirmish with Indians wherever they saw them. They scavenged for food, and tried to curb the high rate of scalpings on the frontier. In January, though, Peter knew that his 3-month break from the British Army would be over, and he would have to leave the Pennsylvania militia. He would cease being a minor officer on the frontier and return to being a foot soldier in a fort along the Great Lakes. He reports to Major Kinnair back in New York. He and a group of soldiers are ordered to destroy an Indian town located to the north of Fort Duquesne. They do so orderly and efficiently. And then they march back up to Oswego. On his way, he gets into another skirmish and gets shot in the hand, losing the ability to move 2 of his fingers. He arrives at the fort in July of 1756 to find a French attack more imminent than when he left. 2 days after his return to the fort, scouts report that the French are transporting equipment overland nearby. 500 men, including Peter, are sent to attack them. They start hunting down the French, and themselves get hunted down by a group of Indians. There's a brief skirmish in the woods, and the Indians are driven off. Not many casualties on either side, because everyone had trees to hide behind. The group keeps moving. Peter tells a story about an Irishman who was put on guard duty one night. He found a barrel of rum that was unattended, and helped himself. Not looking good for those stereotypes. Anyway, after he passed out, they found his body in the morning, scalpless. The commanding officer examined him and was about to order his burial when, to everyone's surprise, he woke up. He didn't even realize he was scalpless until someone told him, and he felt his own head. Nobody thought he would live. They got him to a surgeon and bandaged up his head, and waited. He didn't die the first day, or the second, or the third. His head started to heal up. Peter tells us that just before they parted ways, months after the incident, the man was actually alive and well. They kept traveling and were eventually attacked by a group of 500 French and Indians. They were able to hold a defensive position and fight them off, killing 130 of the enemy and only losing 74 themselves. They took some prisoners and were informed by them that the French army had very low morale and was very badly supplied. It might have been a hopeful sign. The expedition returns to the fort. Within a few weeks, the siege of Oswego would begin. It was the second week in August. The estimates give the French about 5,000 soldiers ready to attack. They have boats on the water, and they're moving their cannons closer to the fort. On the morning of the 10th, some British ships attack the French navy, but the French cannons overpower them. By the afternoon, they had infantry on the shore, and later that night they would be ready to start digging trenches, so they could work their way closer to the fort's walls. Throughout the 11th, musket fire and cannonballs were traded between the two sides all day. The 12th wouldn't be much different. On the night of the 13th, the 370 men inside Fort Ontario, one of the 3 British forts all next to each other, began to pack up or destroy anything that might be useful to the French, as they planned to abandon it. Under cover of darkness, they rush across the river to one of the other forts, without injury. The nights of the 12th and the 13th, French militia are harassing the west side of the river. They try to prepare artillery, but those in the old fort, the second of the 3 forts, our friend Peter being among them, kept cannons aimed and firing at them. On the morning of the 14th, things get rowdy. 2,500 Canadian militia and Indians cross the river towards the old fort, which is defended by only 500 British regulars. The commander of the old fort, seeing this, asks the opposing commander for terms of surrender. He is to surrender all British soldiers to be prisoners of war, and they will be treated well. The deal is accepted. The healthy, able-bodied defenders are escorted out, while the Indians storm the fort and brutally scalp all the sick and wounded as they scream and beg for mercy. From all 3 forts combined, the French gained massive amounts of cannons, guns, and ammunition, as well as over 1,700 prisoners of war. In addition, with the lower shore of the Great Lake under French control, the land to the south of it, large sections of upstate New York between Pennsylvania, Erie, and Albany, were now open to French attack. This was a sizable victory for the French in the North American theater. On the 16th, they started transporting the prisoners. The destination is Quebec by way of Montreal. They arrive in Montreal on the 18th, and while there, the French try to convince the prisoners to join the French army, or at the very least help them out by doing busy work on the battlefield. The vast majority, including Peter, refuse. Those that refused to help the French military were further moved to a place in Quebec, arriving there on September 5th, the beginning of autumn. The countryside in Quebec had been drained of able-bodied workers. As such, while there was a lot of corn and other crops ready for harvest, there was a shortage of people to harvest it. Many of the prisoners volunteered for that work rather than sit in a cell all day, but the turnover rate for this job was high because the prisoners in the cells were actually given more food than the farm laborers. It wasn't long before the French began to worry. Not about food, well, partially about food, but mostly about the fact that there were hundreds of British prisoners in Quebec being guarded by only 18 French soldiers. 18. Needless to say, I wouldn't want to be one of those 18 French soldiers. It made for a nervous situation. Because of this, a prisoner exchange deal was quickly made with England in October, and over 500 prisoners, including Peter, were set free as part of the deal. They would be given transportation to England. After a 6-week journey by boat, Peter arrived in Plymouth, England, and was given a grand total of 6 shillings as payment for his military service. For the 3rd time in his life, his entire life was reset, and he was made to start all over again.
Nimm mich heim, bin ich naus früh am Tag, war der Piwi schon da, hat gesungen sein Lied in die
When the boat got to England, the former prisoners were re-evaluated for possible further military service. Remember that hand wound from when Peter was going up to Oswego in January? Well, those 2 fingers weren't any more functional than they were before. Peter was marked unfit for service and given what amounts to an honorable discharge. His final pay from the Royal Army was 6 shillings. So it's November of 1756. Peter is in a completely new place, in a country that he has only ever spent his childhood in. It must have felt tiring being at the end of the war and having only 6 shillings to build a new life from, but at the same time, sort of freeing. He had no prior engagements, nothing was tying him down to any particular spot. He could go anywhere in the world he could walk to. Well, his first idea for a place to walk to was his childhood home. How far was it exactly? About 1,000 kilometers, give or take. A little under 600 miles. Well, I hope he had good shoes. He ended up walking most of the way through England before he ran out of money in York. While he's in York, though, he had a stroke of luck. He wasn't shy about telling his whole story of the marvelous adventure he had. One of the people who happens to overhear the story is a gentleman of the city who works in a publishing house. He asked Peter to put the story down on paper so he could print it in book form. The result of this is the book that I've been citing on all the other videos about Peter's life. Or at least the very first edition of it. I've been reading a later edition. The book sells 1,000 copies, and Peter earns a good £30 from it. More than enough to get him where he needs to go. Peter also takes quite a few copies of the book with him on his further trek north. In every town he stops in, he dresses up like an Indian, tells the story, and sells books. He probably took his time traveling and lived quite comfortably on the road because it wasn't until 1758 that he got back to Aberdeen. Finally, he starts looking for family. Sources on his family are few and far between, but I read somewhere that his mother had passed away since he was kidnapped, and I read somewhere else that he found his brother and a few cousins who all testified that they recognized him. I couldn't find much else on any of his relatives. Now, I mentioned the word testify. Don't worry, I'm getting to that. Just because Peter was back in Aberdeen, he didn't stop dressing up like an Indian and selling books. Well, as it happened, he remembered the name of one of the people who kidnapped him, and he had no problem saying it. Well, the kidnapper, who also happened to be one of the city officials, caught wind of this pretty quick. Peter was arrested one day in June, and all his books were confiscated. They charged him with libel and slander, gave him a very rigged trial, and put him in the local jail, Tolbooth Prison, now converted into a museum. His books were publicly burned in the town square. He was fined and forced to sign a legal document saying that the parts of his book incriminating the man were fiction before they let him go. Just for good measure, after this, they banished him from the city. Well, what now? I guess I'll go live in Edinburgh. He went there and opened up a coffee house right under Parliament House. Being so close to Parliament, it became a hotspot for lawyers to visit after work. See where I'm going with this? He made some friends who had an intimate knowledge of the legal system. They looked at his story and encouraged him to sue the magistrates of Aberdeen using the Edinburgh court system. He said, well, why not, and went ahead with it. And he won. The judges found unanimously in Peter's favor, ruling that the Provost of Aberdeen, 4 of the Bailies, and the Dean of Guild, nice title, were to pay him £100 in damages for his false imprisonment. But that wasn't all. That trial was just about false imprisonment, and appealing the slander charges. His next court target was Mr. William Fordyce, one of the judges found guilty in the previous case, whom Peter accused of kidnapping. First, the case was tried in their local Aberdeenshire. Fordyce, of course, was good friends with the judge, even having dinner with him the night before the trial. He got off scot-free. Wonder why? Okay, back to Edinburgh. Public, class, court case. Import judges. Import evidence. Public, static, void, blah blah blah. Judges equals new judges. Evidence document equals new evidence. Literally a piece of paper detailing the exact amount of money each child was sold for in the New World. Not sure how Peter got a hold of this, but yeah, that was a literal piece of evidence presented in this court case. Judges.examine document. Closing brackets. Compile courtcase.java. Run courtcase.jar. Processing. Processing. The court finds William Fordyce to be guilty of kidnapping. He is ordered to pay Peter Williamson £200 in damages. God save King George! Yes, in December 1763, he won his second court victory for a grand total of £300 plus legal fees in winnings. This amounted to a modest fortune. What did he do with it? Well, he opened up a tavern on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and he commissioned a big wooden figure of him wearing an Indian costume to be put on the street corner to attract customers. It seems like that venture went well because 5 years later, in 1769, he also opened up his own print shop. Around this time, he taught himself printing, invented a portable printer for his own convenience, and invented a waterproof ink that could be used to stamp linens. Then, a few years later, in 1773, he completed a street directory for the city of Edinburgh, which was basically a map of all the places and addresses in the city. A lot of online sources talk about this like it was its own accomplishment, but I think that brings down the value of his purpose for doing it. In 1774, Peter started a business offering to deliver anything up to 3 pounds in weight up to 1 mile from the city centre. This was the first post office in Edinburgh, and he called it Williamson's Penny Post because it only cost a penny per package. He hired a crew of 4 mailmen and gave them hats that numbered 1, 4, 8, and 16 to make the business look bigger than it was. And then he opened up several locations throughout the city. This continued until 1793 when the venture was bought out by the entity that would later become the Royal Mail. They paid Peter £25 up front and gave him a yearly pension of 25 shillings. And that's how Scotland got mail. No joke. Awesome, right? Peter married a woman named Jean Wilson, daughter of John Wilson, in 1777, but they divorced after 11 years. He spent the remainder of his life running that tavern on the Royal Mile. Some sources say he became an alcoholic during his late life. He died in 1799 of liver disease, and was buried in the Old Calton Burial Ground in Edinburgh. The grave is currently unmarked, but one of the websites I use told me Edinburgh tour guides are able to point out the general location. And this is why I love this time period. There are so many people who have interesting stories like this, and even someone who spent the first half of their life going between one kidnapping and another can go on to contribute some cool new inventions to the printing industry and start the first post office in Edinburgh. You go, Peter.
The northern lights of old Aberdeen mean home, sweet home to me. The northern lights of Aberdeen are what I long to see. I've been a wanderer all of my life, and many a sight I've seen. Godspeed the day when I'm